Welcome to City Cinematheque, where the art and pleasure of the movies are the subject of serious discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach film studies at the City College of the City University of New York. Today we're going to be screening the classic 1931 German film, M, directed by Fritz Lang. This is the film that really sets the standard for what we may now call the serial killer genre. It's one of the great crime films in film history. It's also an innovative work from the early sound era. It's also one of the films that shows us who Fritz Lang will perhaps become when he comes to America after leaving Germany. And joining us today to talk about that and a whole set of other things is a very special guest. It will be Peter Bogdanovich, the distinguished film director, actor, author, and film historian. Now, enjoy the pleasures of Fritz Lang's M and join us afterwards for a discussion with Peter Bogdanovich. Welcome back to City Cinematheque. You've just had the chance to see one of the greatest crime films ever made, and certainly a very important film for the career of Fritz Lang, for the development of what will later become film noir and a whole set of other crime films, and a film we can still learn a lot about its visuals and its uses of sound. Here to talk with us about that and a lot of other things today, it's a pleasure to welcome to City Cinematheque Peter Bogdanovich, known to many of our viewers for his own very distinguished films, for his writings, and for his constant interest in film history.
Hello, Jerry. Good to see you.
Good to have you here, Peter.
Thank you.
Let's talk perhaps about the first time that M and Fritz Lang came on your radar. Were you, a film goer in New York? You were an avid film goer at MoMA in those days, I think.
I must have seen it at the Museum of Modern Art, but I've seen the picture a number of times over the years, and just recently. It's an extraordinary film, isn't it? I mean, yeah. Lang always, I did have the privilege of meeting Fritz Lang and interviewing him for a while in the 60s, late 60s. And he always thought it was his best film, period. I think he probably was right.
Yeah.
Although I like a lot of his American films. He, however, felt that it was his best film, probably because he had complete freedom while making it. He had the money, he had the right to do whatever he wanted. Nobody interfered. They could do however they wanted to structure it. So, in fact, even the choice of the subject matter was something that he and his then wife, right, Thea von Harbou, chose. They were trying to figure out what was the worst thing, what was the worst crime. And they decided the worst crime was a child murderer. And their intention, was to pick the worst crime and then still say that capital punishment, that they didn't approve of capital punishment, which the movie sort of says. Interestingly, by the defense attorney, who's a criminal. That the irony of that kangaroo court is quite something at the end, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely stunning. It's one of the things that's very interesting is that we're now talking about this film 70 years later, and the kind of weight of debate about this kind of thing hasn't lessened in any sense. I mean, the what's being said at the kangaroo court, the call for vengeance, the call for, essentially that the state shouldn't pay to even perpetuate the life of someone like this, versus the plea that no other human being, much less the state, has the right to kill someone if they've done something that's not under their own will or volition, is like something off of one of the debate shows on PBS today, much less the op-ed page. So I think that's part of the sort of striking modernity of this film, its contemporariness 70 years later, while we're in a different century ourselves.
Yeah, I was struck by that, and the irony of how it's told, the choice of having the basic theme of the picture, and the arguments, right, the moral arguments being argued by criminals, I thought was still a very striking idea.
Oh, absolutely. You also bring up by that this whole notion of how the film is structured, because while we have at the center of this, I mean, a child murderer, this is not, and you might say the film is set up as a kind of chase. I mean, it is the pursuit of this murderer. It's really different from, I think, what we think of as the normal way in which these materials would be handled. I mean, for example, the chief policeman isn't even introduced until well into the film.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think about what impresses you about the way in which the story is told, Peter?
Well, it's unusual. The construction is very unusual. It's a lot of it is silent. The early sections of it are silent, but this is 1931, right? So it's really only 2 years of sound, 2 full years of sound, 29 and 30, before this picture came out, which means it was probably shot in 30. His use of sound is very modern and very free.
Indeed.
He doesn't seem to be penned in by the problems of sound. Using somebody talking over shots that are not him talking. It was pretty revolutionary at that time. Interestingly enough, the first 2-3 years of sound pictures, when you're dealing with the best directors, right. Lang, obviously one of the great directors, Lubitsch, those, and Hitchcock in his first sound film, a few others, they felt a kind of liberation, which is still, you can still feel it. Being able to have them talk and have it over shots of other things, for example, which Lang does quite a bit in the
Absolutely.
picture. That's unusual, and you associate that with a much later period.
Right, and in fact, it's interesting because there's a way in which even today, many of the uses of, I'm going to say audiovisual media, because I'm going to include television and lots of other stuff, still finds it a little bit difficult to do that. I mean, people, that whole notion of that, well, gee, the camera, the thing that Hitchcock hated the most, the camera's really there to watch people talking.
Yeah, Hitchcock said most pictures are pictures of people talking, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
And that's
And that's not true in this film.
Not at all.
No. But talking about the construction, I think it's brilliantly constructed, beginning with the mother calling for her child, the one who gets the only child that you see abducted and killed. You don't really see her killed either, and that leads me to one of the most chilling and I think most instructive sequences in the picture in terms of what we could all learn from it. I talked to Lang about it, which is the actual killing of the child.
Right.
What happens to the child, we don't know really. It isn't just a question of taste, the fact that he doesn't show it. What's fascinating to me is and I've used it as an example of the responsibility of the filmmaker. I mean, there really isn't a more horrible thought or crime than a child murder, as we keep having that happen, and we're struck with the grisly details. Lang leaves the details to the imagination of the viewer, and so he does it in 3 or 4 very simple shots. The mother's calling the name Elsie, and you have a shot of the staircase, the empty laundry room, where the table setting, where the child was expected for lunch, and then he goes rather surprisingly to a bush, and you just see the little rubber ball that the child was playing with roll out, and stops. And then you cut and you see the balloon, kind of a little figure, a balloon floating up, catches briefly in some electrical wires and goes off. And that's it. And I asked Lang about that. He said, because he said to me, well, imagine that I could show what this monster does, what he does to her. If I could show it. It's not just a question of taste. But how can I show it? But if I did, he said, it would be very specific. By not showing it, a chill goes up everybody's back because everybody in the audience imagines for themselves the worst thing that they could imagine. So he says, in that way, I make the audience my collaborator, because in their mind, each person for himself chooses what is the most horrible thing they can imagine, or chooses not to imagine by just blocking it. One way or the other, you're blocking something.
Right, absolutely.
And when you see the film, that is really, as you said to me some years ago now, a chill runs up the spine, and it does still. And that's filmmaking. And I just wish that modern filmmakers would look at that sequence as an example, not just of the responsibility of the filmmaker not to put prurient sex and violence on the screen, but as a way of, by indirection, making the audience a kind of intelligent collaborator with them.
Oh, I think that's a point very well taken. I think also you bring up a larger strategy that he has. This film is very complex in its structure, but it's also very, very tight in it, because he frequently leaves things out. There's all kinds of leaps in the film, and there are classic things like parallel editing between the criminals and the police. He'll use things like the sweep of the arm.
I noticed that. I thought that was fascinating. That was very modern. The sweep of one man's arm and going into the sweep of the other man's arm, but not in a close-up and not obviously. It's almost, you have to be a filmmaker to really notice it. It just seems very smooth. Yeah, and the irony of the police juxtaposed with the criminals who are saying this is bad for business, and the police saying essentially the same thing, they're getting in trouble. That's very witty, I think, and mordant. The construction of all that is very good. He sets up this monstrous crime, a series of crimes, serial killer, 8 times he says, shows the public's reaction to it, shows how the killer does it, shows the murder by indirection, and then goes to the results and so on. And Peter Lorre, who barely has a word of dialogue until the end, what a performance that is. Absolutely. Extraordinary performance. All again done with very simple strokes, complicated, complex, but simple strokes of, showing him ordering a couple of brandies when he can't get that one girl, when he's frustrated in his attempts, and it's shown through bushes and so on. I mean, all the choices are pretty brilliant.
Yeah. Did you have a chance to chat with Lang about the issue of directing actors at all, or did you observe him at that? I mean, certainly you observed the performance was great. Okay.
The performance is brilliant, and it's fascinating how the picture has, so much of the picture is silent, or not silent, but so much of it is where the sound is used as a counterpoint to the image. And then the last sequence is very much a sound sequence that could not have been made properly in a silent film, because of all that dialogue and Peter Lorre's extraordinary performance when he breaks down and says, this irresistible impulse, this terrible compulsion he has, and how he plays all that. It's extraordinary use of dialogue as dialogue, which he hasn't really done up to then. So, no, I didn't have a chance to see Fritz Lang direct. By the time I was interviewing him, he didn't make another film. And we talked about actors. From other actors, for some actors I spoke to, like Henry Fonda, he was very meticulous and, moved people's arms and so on. And sometimes you notice little things that the actors are sometimes a little stiff, like they've been directed to do certain things. There's a couple of bits that I'm not sure work exactly any longer. I don't know how they'd play with a modern audience, like when the police commissioner drops his cigar when he hears that that the criminals were after a child murderer. I'm not sure how that would play today. I'd probably get a laugh. which maybe it got in its day.
Yeah.
I don't know. But it's a strange moment. It's clearly a directed moment, but it sort of works too on a certain level. So it's interesting. The picture isn't really dated. No. It isn't really dated in its technique. It still has you wish people could make pictures as well every day as that picture is made.
Right. Well, also one of the other things that hasn't dated about it is that the incredible sense of unease that he creates about modern urban life is something that I think lingers with us, even among us that love that love cities. It's
yeah, the way he takes you into, for example, the whole situation with the beggars, when the criminals are saying, how are we going to catch this guy? Who could follow him? Who could be inconspicuous? And the beggars' union, so to speak. And then you see, I think in one shot, it's kind of an elaborate dolly shot, maybe the most elaborate shot in the picture, in terms of camera moves and a single shot conveying an enormous amount, is that shot when he shows you the cigars and cigarettes being laid out, and then it goes on to the sausages and the food and everything that these beggars, sort of in this beggar's restaurant or something. You don't really know quite what it is, but it's all done in one or two shots. There's a tricky shot in the middle where it pans up, and I think he might have cut in there. But it's so well concealed that it all seems like one shot. That takes you into a world that an urban world that you know, wow, that's the way it is. How weird,
yeah.
And how interesting that is, and that it's all organized like that.
Yeah.
I'm sure that was true. Lang told me that he worked very much throughout his career by collecting newspaper clippings.
Oh, really?
He would read the newspapers and pull clippings of things that interested him, and that's how he often put together stories based on newspaper.
A kind
clippings.
of collage is.
Yeah, using that's an interesting. They will use that here, or this is interesting. We use that there. The other thing he talked about, which I thought was very, very interesting, is how when he's making a film, how he feels that a good film should play to different audiences and should work for different audiences on different levels.
Okay.
So he talks about how this film, M, could work for a certain, let's say, stratum of the audience as a pure crime thriller. Here's a killer, how do we catch him?
Right.
Then on another level, it works interesting as police procedure and criminal procedure, just on that level. And then there's the psychiatric level in terms of but there's all these different levels. You get to maybe the highest level is that it's an argument against or for capital punishment.
Right.
It seems to be an argument against capital punishment. The criminal lawyer, the criminal
right.
who's a lawyer for the criminal, says the state must protect someone who can't help what he does. All that. So, and this gets us to the question of, in the older days,
Right.
not just in Germany, but in America, films were made for the whole audience, where a younger person might see the film in a certain way and for a certain reason and be interested in it for a certain reason, whereas an adult might be interested in it for a totally different reason, and yet it would still work. That idea of not creating a movie for a particular niche or a particular age group, that seems to have disappeared, which is
I think
sad. I think.
I think you bring up an excellent point, which I never thought of quite in that way before. And you might describe it as the enormous generosity of the storytelling of that epoch. That is, that when you go, it's a story rich enough in its characters and its event that it allows different doors of entrance, different entry points.
Well, I think it's a very important point. This is all before there were rating systems. Of course, 31 was before America had a production code, and they didn't have such a thing in Germany. But nevertheless, M is certainly a film that anybody could see.
Right.
there's nothing in it that a child couldn't see. It's horrible, but it's not the point where the kid is going to be haunted.
Right.
If anything, he'll just be careful of strangers who try to offer him candy and a balloon.
Exactly.
In fact, that's one of the things Lang said, that the film was intended to tell parents to be careful. You know, where are your children? Which is one of the last things the film says. That you see the mother sitting there, and that's not going to bring whatever happens to the killer is not going to bring our children back. We have to learn to be more careful. We have to watch our children.
It's interesting because there are, that is Lang's ending, but in different prints there are variant endings. And actually some people cut that out because it takes the film to this higher plane. It takes it, to one, it is actually, is addressing parents to have to do this.
Directly.
It's a direct address. But some of the films actually end with some of the prints actually end with the arm of the law
on Peter Lorre's shoulder.
Peter Lorre's shoulder.
Well, it's a very tight and daring conclusion, because he doesn't even show the police. He shows the criminals raising their hands, the hand of the law, in the name of the law. Then you go to the law court in the name of the law, and then you go to the mothers. Is marvelously direct and swift and potent way of finishing that story. Boom, it's over.
Well, I can tell by the way you describe that another one of the things that you admire about the film is that it actually puts a pleasurable burden upon the spectator, and that pleasurable burden is of constructing the story out of those fragments. That is, he gives just the amount of information in a shot or a scene that you need, and then he moves on. And that it's the spectator, whether that be a child or whether it be an adult, who has that responsibility of stitching together.
Yeah, the putting it together. Well, that's what he does in that murder sequence we talked about too. It's by indirection. It's by not showing, or by only showing certain elements that the audience then fills in the gaps in their own way. It just seems like, you look at a film like that and you say, what happened? How did we dumb it down to the point where we are now?
Yeah. So let's talk about what happens to, because you've written about all of Lang, not just about M, and have a comprehensive knowledge of his work. So as everyone knows, or most of the world knows, Mr. Lang fled Nazi Germany and came to the United States and had a very distinguished career here.
He had a good career in America, never quite to the, don't forget, Lang was in pre-war Germany, pre-World War II Germany, post-World War I Germany, so from, say, 1919 to 1932.
Right.
He became one of the two preeminent directors in the German film industry, which was second only to the American.
Correct.
In terms of popularity, because the films didn't have sound, so you put in titles and films could be, and Lubitsch. Lang and Lubitsch. Lubitsch was more popular probably because he made somewhat slightly more successful films, or somewhat slightly more accessible films, although that's not true really, because Lang made all those serials, crime serials. So they were both at the top of their profession in Germany. Lubitsch came to America in the mid-20s. Lang stayed until Hitler
rose to power.
Rose to power. Hitler, as you know, through Goebbels, asked Lang to take over the Third Reich, the Third Reich's film industry, and Lang fled evidently that evening, without even the money in his bank, and went to France and made a film, and then came to America. And had an interesting career up and down. He never had the power that he quite had, or the prestige that he quite had. The irony, I suppose, that you could say, the big irony in Lang's career, is that he was, in fact, in the 20s, and even later, but particularly in the 20s, associated with crime melodramas and spy pictures, Spion, The Spies, and other films. Dr. Mabuse. And so when Hitchcock began to make crime pictures in England in the 20s, having been influenced quite a bit by German filmmaking. He spent some time in Berlin at UFA, Hitchcock. He was referred to in early days as the English Fritz Lang.
Right.
And later on in Fritz Lang's career, he was referred to as the German Alfred Hitchcock. So it was, I don't think Fritz Lang was a very happy man in his later years. In fact, he wasn't very happy, if that's a criterion, but he was a haunted man. I mean, what a life. When you realize that the woman he was married to, Thea von Harbach, who was his collaborator for many films in the 20s, he left her behind, and she stayed and joined the Nazi Party and became a collaborator of Hitler. So, you know, I don't know how you deal with that sort of thing in your life.
No, well, it's...
Fritz also went blind, I'm sorry to say. But he had trouble seeing. A lot of the older directors had trouble with their eyes because of the smoke from the carbon arcs in those early films.
Oh, you know, I certainly one knew of the incidents. There's Raoul Walsh, John Ford.
Yeah, Alan Dwan. Several of them had trouble with their eyes as a result of the carbon arc smoke.
Right. I had
particularly in the teens.
Right.
And early 20s.
Okay, well, I learned something that I'd never known about what the source of what that.
Yeah, it was that smoke was very bad for you. Huh. that the carbon arc would emit.
I had a friend who went to a very good university that was very good at inviting people from this era while they were still among us. Except he said, you know, I saw more guys who were great directors with patches over their eyes while I was undergraduate. I said, I would go and there would be John Ford, and then, you know, Raoul. 6 months later, you know, there would be Raoul Walsh, and there was another guy with a patch.
Yeah, well, of course, Raoul actually lost an eye from an freak accident, but they all had this problem from, you know, it was actually an occupational hazard. Right.
Well, they were there, and all part of the invention of the medium. Well, we're going to come back on our another show and talk about Hitchcock, and I think then we'll be able to talk a little bit more about this relationship between let's call it the Langian cinema and the Hitchcock cinema, because it's a pretty rich relationship.
I remember one thing Fritz Lang said. Remember the scariest thing he ever said to me when he fixed me with his eye, and he was wearing a monocle in those days. And he said, just remember, Peter, you pay for what you get. Oh, boy. That has reverberated down the years, I must say. He was speaking from his own experience, but I must say he was right.
Indeed. Well, we'll be talking about that aspect of the lives of directors and a lot of other things in the coming weeks. If you'd like to know more about this series, please feel free to contact us. The best way to do so these days is actually by going to our website, www.cuny.tv. Click on to City Cinematheque and you'll find a way to communicate with us. Let me give you that website just one more time, www.cuny.tv. Peter, it's been a pleasure having you here today, bringing your wealth of knowledge and your direct experience of, a wonderful artist like Fritz Lang. We look forward to chatting with you about other films in coming weeks.
Me too, Jerry. Thanks for having me.
Great. And I hope that you join us once again as we try to discover what some of the riches of the archives of film history are here on City Cinematheque. Thanks for joining us today.